To be here today to talk to you about the what and why of pre-registration. So we'll start with the what. Okay, what is pre-registration? Pre-registration is a commitment to study design and or a data analysis plan and or study hypotheses prior to commencing the study. So seems simple enough. It's committing to a plan ahead of time. The reason that I'm emphasizing the and or is one of the things that I want to emphasize about pre-registration is that there are many different features of a study or a research process that could be registered, and they're not all mandatory. So one of the common misconceptions about pre-registration among academics is that if you're not doing confirmatory hypothesis testing, then pre-registration is not appropriate for you. But it turns out there are a lot of benefits to pre-registering the study design, the data analysis plan, independent of whether or not the study has specific theoretically derived hypotheses. So we're going to focus on those benefits. So pre-registration helps us to see the dividing line between more exploratory research, which is flexible and has decisions that might be made dependent on the data, and more confirmatory research that has constraints applied and it makes decisions a priori or ahead of time. So I've linked a couple of resources down at the bottom for you to be able to look into this a little bit more in terms of kind of the theory behind the practice. The De Groot paper from 1956 is one of the earlier papers on this topic, and it's always sort of interesting, given the renewed interest in these practices now, to note that these are not new ideas, right? There's nothing sort of revolutionary about scientists advocating for declaring details about the study prior to it being done. But as we saw in Samin's talk, it is very important for the rigor of our conclusions that we do adhere to this process, and that we know when a decision has been made relative to when the data were collected. So some key features of pre-registration, it's time-stamped, so we know that it happens prior to the study's beginning, so it's before the study. It's a read-only document, so it means that you are not editing the pre-registration after the study has begun, and typically it will be posted in some kind of repository. So I'll give some examples of what those repositories might look like in a moment, but these are kind of the basic features. Okay. So moving on a little bit to the why is it the case that we need to pre-register? There are several distinct goals that explain why we might want to engage in this practice. So building on what Samin was talking about before, one of our main priorities for doing this practice is that we want to constrain researcher flexibility and avoid overfitting to our data. So if we make decisions about how we're going to analyze the data based on the data that we've collected, we run the risk of making our conclusions too specific to that particular sample or that particular study. So by setting our decisions ahead of time, we can reduce the possibility of strategically using flexibility to do things like get a statistically significant result. Pre-registration can also increase transparency and rigor, and I gather that that is a really central and important value for folks in the government, probably always, but maybe especially now. There's been an enhanced focus on increasing the transparency of practices. And if we have transparency in our studies, that can help us to make the case that our conclusions are more sound, potentially. Finally, pre-registration can also help us to falsify and test theories. So if you are working in that mode where you have a specific theoretically derived hypothesis, there's a chance with pre-registration to prove yourself wrong, right? If we don't set those conditions ahead of time for how we plan to do the study and how we plan to interpret the results in terms of how they come out, we lose that chance to falsify. It becomes impossible to falsify a particular conclusion because we can change the prediction, we can change the way that we analyze the data in such a way that almost any result would support our hypothesis. Okay? So these goals would drive our practices. So we're going to have different focuses on different features of pre-registration depending on which one of these goals that you have. Now, as Samin noted, there's a lot of flexibility that we can potentially constrain in our research, and that, or if we leave this flexibility unconstrained, we have the potential for making strategic decisions and overfitting. So in terms of the different steps of the research process, I'm breaking it down here by methods of our studies, how we analyze our data, and then what we do when we ultimately report those results. We have flexibility at each of these different stages. So in terms of the methods, the stopping rule refers to the rule that we use to decide when we're going to stop data collection. So that's an area where there can be flexibility. If we allow people to just continue collecting data until a particular conclusion is reached, then we run into problems, particularly with null hypothesis significance testing. For the methods, there's also implications for power planning. So how well powered do we want our studies to be in terms of statistical power? That's something that should be decided ahead of time, but often is left flexible. Also, in terms of the methods, we have unique scoring. So if you are creating a variable out of your data, say by combining multiple questions together to form a total, or you are scraping data from different sources and then combining that to form some kind of data in your analysis, you know that there's a lot of different choices about how you can do those combination processes. So you might look at certain databases and not others, or you might include certain items and not others. Many, many, many possibilities here. That's an area where flexibility can enter in or be controlled when we pre-register how we intend to score or aggregate our data. In terms of analysis, again, there are many possibilities here for flexibility. We can analyze certain subgroups and ignore others. We can split the data into subgroups or analyze it as a whole. We can exclude outliers strategically. We can choose different statistical tests. I'm sure you know there are many, many choices often in terms of the type of analysis that we might do. So do we want a multi-level model? Do we want a simple model? Do we want to analyze at the level of the group, the individual? Many possibilities here as well. And those different tests are sometimes going to point to the same conclusion, but sometimes not. So by setting that expectation ahead of time, we can reduce flexibility in terms of strategically choosing a test. Finally, in terms of data cleaning, this is another area where if you're getting data from a source and you have to curate it or clean it for use in your own analysis, you know that there are many, many choices that go into how you ultimately gather that data. Finally, in terms of reporting, even if we're not omitting statistically non-significant results, we often see a focus on results that are statistically significant. So there can be choices in terms of how we choose to report that emphasize the things that ultimately turned out to be significant and de-emphasize the things that turned out to be not significant in a way that's inconsistent or doesn't agree with how we originally thought about the research question that we were testing. We can have selective omission, so leaving out results that are discongruent with other results. And we can have outcome switching, as Samin mentioned. So if we collect 2 or 3 different dependent variables and we only emphasize the one that gives the most favorable or the most theory consistent result. So this might sound overwhelming. There's a lot of different choices to make, a lot of different details to think about when you're considering your pre-registration plan. So I do like to emphasize that we shouldn't feel like we have to make these changes all at once, and we could, move more slowly and build on the practices that we already have to introduce new practices. So we start out with something that sounds relatively simple, make a plan and declare it ahead of time, and then if it turns out that there are many, many possible ways to make that plan. But we shouldn't become overwhelmed because we can build on our existing good habits. So there are lots of different options for registries for actually doing a pre-registration. So I'll highlight 3 kind of major options. So you could have just an internal or non-public system. Now this depends on the type of work that you're doing. I imagine, sometimes when I speak to people who are working in business or organizations, there's some sense of information being proprietary or secret or otherwise not shareable. And so I just like to emphasize that even if that's the case, you can still use a system for pre-registration within your own organization. So, for example, I've heard that a decent amount of OPRE work happens through contracts. So you could have an internal system where you pre-register, where vendors or clients pre-register research. It's reviewed internally by OPRE, and there's a process there, even if that process isn't happening in a public registry that everyone could access. In addition to internal or non-public systems, you could use a simple template. So there's a website called aspredicted.org that has 9 simple questions for pre-registration. The attractive features of this system is that it's relatively simple. The unattractive features for me are that it is relatively non-public. So registrations that are done on aspredicted.org are not searchable in any way. They can only be disclosed via a link that the person who created the registration gives to someone else. So as a kind of system-wide approach, it doesn't really work because ultimately we want to be able to see all of the studies that have been registered and what has happened with those studies, not just the studies that authors choose to reveal. There are also full-fledged registries, and I have a few examples of these listed here. So the Center for Open Science has the Open Science Framework, which is a very robust and flexible system for pre-registration. There's also, within economics, the American Economic Association has its own registry. Likewise, in political science, there's an EGAP registry and a variety of registries within biomedicine, including clinicaltrials.gov and the World Health Organization's repository. So you might choose a full-fledged registry based on the topic or the domain of interest. If you were looking for kind of the most domain general and broadly applicable registry, I would recommend the Open Science Framework. What I'm showing here is just a screen cap of what a registration looks like. You can't see it because of the contrast on the slide, but it would be ultimately marked read-only. So this would be once someone had registered the study, the details would be there and findable within the system, but not editable by the original author. So it includes, some description of what's being registered, answers to questions in a particular form that has been filled out, links to files, and so on. So it's a very robust system. I'm not going to talk in detail today about how to use the system, but if there's some questions about how it works, that could be something we could talk about in the Q&A. So instead, what I'm going to switch to is tips for doing a successful pre-registration. So assume you have a project, you've selected a repository, you're ready to do the pre-registration. What can you do to be successful? Number 1 tip is use a template. So a template would be, a series of questions or features of a study to be pre-registered that you declare ahead of time. Using a template is useful because it increases standardization from study to study, so you can always review kind of your broader array of work consistently. And it's also the case that it's very easy to forget elements of these plans. Like I said, there are many possible details and many ways that you could constrain flexibility in your study, and it's extremely easy to just simply miss one, forget about one. So using a template makes it less likely that that will happen and increases consistency from study to study. I have some examples on the next slide, or some links, I should say, to where you can go to get templates, because there are a variety of templates for different types of research designs, different disciplines, and so on. My next tip is peer review pre-study. Now, you might see peer review and you might think about journal publications, but what I'm actually talking about here is just some kind of review of the plan prior to the study beginning. Okay. So I'll talk in a moment about a type of journal article that has been spreading in popularity called registered reports. Samin mentioned it briefly already as well. In a registered report, a journal oversees the process of registration of a study. So someone submits a protocol or proposal to the journal. That journal gets reviewed by peers and an editor. and the plan for the study can then be improved and made more specific through the process of that registration. So even if you are not doing pre-registration in the context of a registered reports journal, it can still be really, really useful to get this kind of outside eye on the work. So it could be a buddy system where, you know, one team prepares a registration, another team reviews it. It could be, again, something that, you know, the client prepares a registration and the program officer or project manager reviews it. But the idea is that someone who's not directly involved with this, with the study, gets some eyes on the plan. Again, this can help improve the quality of it, and it can help make sure that certain details aren't missed. Third step is to plan for power. So statistical power is extremely important to make sure that your study is likely to be informative regardless of the outcome. So we know that if you do an underpowered study, you might get a result that's ambiguous or not as informative as you like. So planning for power is a really, really key step in the pre-registration process. We want to be specific. If a study is pre-registered but it's done in a vague way, perhaps there's some merit to having that pre-registration, but it's almost the vaguer that it gets, you might as well have not done that step at all. So if the goal of a pre-registration is to constrain that additional flexibility, but the actual document itself doesn't do that, it doesn't constrain what researchers do, then it will have limited value. Likewise, you should know how you'll draw a conclusion. So if you, you plan your study, you should know no matter how the results come out, this study is going to be informative in some way. So the results turn out null, that's what this means for the conclusion that we draw. The results turn out significant, okay, that's what this means. This contrast turns out this way. So thinking through those decision trees ahead of time to make sure that there are not outcomes that are possible that are in some way uninformative. Okay. It also, one way that I've seen this done is you can actually prepare the final report that you're going to write, so whether it be the report or journal article or whatever, and it can be prepared without the results included, but with sort of contingencies. So if this is statistically significant, then we have this passage, which shows how we interpret the result. If it's not statistically significant, here's this other passage that shows. I've gone through this process myself. It's very challenging. It's really challenging to sort of think through all of the details of how a study will work out before you've done it. Okay, so my last tip is to have peer review post-study. So again, just like having eyes on the pre-registration before the study begins can be useful, it's useful to have them again at the end, and specifically, this can be useful for checking adherence to the plan. Now, of course, we don't always adhere to every detail of the plans that we make in our pre-registrations, and that's totally fine. The important thing is that those deviations do get disclosed transparently in the final report. So it can be easy for that kind of information to get omitted, even unintentionally, or to be kind of obscured or buried. So the function of that secondary outside review of a registration is to make sure that the tests that were planned in the registration have actually been done, that deviations from the plan are disclosed. Okay. So as I said, there's some links in the slides which are up on the OPRE website for this workshop. So we have links to lots of different templates for different domains and different study designs, and it's also some links to resources for power analysis. Okay, so here are some of the basic questions that might be asked in a template. This is kind of like a slimmed down version of what would be provided in one of these templates. So when you're doing a pre-registration, you would outline the main research question. You would specify what your key variables are and how they're measured. You would give hypotheses if you have them. Again, not everybody has specific hypotheses derived from theories. They may just have research questions or something that doesn't involve a specific directional prediction. Conditions and randomization, again, if appropriate. Not all studies are randomized experiments, so that might not be appropriate. sample size and your stopping rule, so how you'll decide how many people to collect or how many data points to collect and when to stop collecting data. What features qualify you to be in the study, so inclusion criteria, and then what features would cause you to be removed from the analysis. So if we're going to remove data points for being outliers, what are the conditions that, that would necessitate that ahead of time? I have a highlighted one here, positive controls, because this is, depending on your area of training, this might be familiar to you or less familiar, and it might have gone under different names. But positive controls basically mean that we have some kind of outcome neutral test that helps you to verify the validity of your manipulation or measurement. So kind of in the spirit of making sure that your study is informative regardless of how the results turn out, you want to be certain that the manipulation that you've introduced or the variables that you're measuring have been measured or manipulated in a valid way. So for example, if it was a drug trial, right, we would want to know about drug adherence, right? Do people actually do the treatment that they're assigned to? I have another like non-human subjects example from the Galileo spacecraft. So the Galileo spacecraft did a bunch of things, but among other things, it had sensors to detect life. And the very first thing that they did with the spacecraft is they put it up and they tested it to see if it could detect life on Earth. Because if it doesn't detect life on Earth, it's not going to detect life anywhere else. Okay? So you want those, again, these are positive controls. They're features of the study that help you make sure that your result is going to be informative no matter. Right? We wouldn't want it to be the case that we'd say, oh, we got a null result. That's because there's no life on Earth, right? It's because the measurement failed. So it's not the study's main outcome. So in addition to those positive controls, you can provide an analysis plan, and if you want to be very thorough and rigorous, you can provide code. So you can simulate data that will match the structure of the data that you're ultimately going to have in your study, and then your code will be sort of ready to go to run on the data once it comes in. If you have existing data, so you're gathering data from a repository, there's going to be additional questions and details that you have to specify for that. So one of the things I said is that, you know, we want to make sure that these plans are specific and not vague. And in doing so, we want to make sure that our critical study details are constrained. So for example, we could register that we plan to collect data from 100 subjects, but we wouldn't necessarily know if that's before or after the exclusions have been applied. Is that people have measured individually or in groups? What happens if we don't hit our target? There's still a lot of unconstrained flexibility in that one sentence, right? So each part of the plan needs to be scrutinized to make sure that it's specific. And these are the kinds of things that you confront immediately when it comes time to analyze the data. But what we're trying to do is shift that confrontation to the front part of the research process rather than the back end. Okay, just one more example. You could say I'm going to do a 2x3 mixed ANOVA. That's my planned analysis. But hidden within that, which planned comparison in the 2x3 is the one that tests the focal hypothesis? Are there assumption checks? Do we need to do follow-up tests or contrasts? Right? Still many more decisions to make, even if we've made a pretty tight specification for the type of analysis that we're doing. So the benefits of this practice, it can increase transparency and potentially rigor or quality if it's adhered to well, and that can decrease our focus on questionable research practices and overfitting. So although there are many benefits to the process, there are also a lot of myths about the process, and I'm going to spin through these relatively quickly. I'm going to attempt to. So one myth is that it stifles creativity. So if you can't sort of explore and play with the data, then that is somehow going to interfere with the process by which you analyze the data. All that pre-registration really does is spell out the line between what's exploratory and what's confirmatory. It doesn't prohibit exploratory testing. It doesn't prohibit deviating from the plan. All it asks for is for people to be clear about when they've done one or the other. Another myth is that if we just simply mandate this as a practice, that we'll have a guaranteed increase in quality. And of course, that's not the case. There are many ways to do the practice well and many ways that wouldn't achieve the goals that we have with pre-registration. What a mandate will do is it will incentivize, so people will try to comply with the mandate. And it also signals, so it signals the values of the organization or the party that is requesting you to do this practice, but it's not going to guarantee quality on its own. The individual people who are actually engaging in it have to take steps to make sure that it's a rigorous process. One myth is that it mostly addresses p-hacking, but actually there are many other things that it can address. So it could be just about increasing transparency of the research process. It could be about increasing the quality of those processes. So again, if you have peer review ahead of time, there's a chance for someone to catch an error or a suboptimal design feature that otherwise wouldn't have been caught until after the study was done. If you are doing hypothesis testing research, you have a chance to falsify those hypotheses. Okay. Another myth is that it solves p-hacking, which we should see that it wouldn't necessarily solve p-hacking unless our pre-registration constrains lighter flexibility. So if we don't make the pre-registration specific, we will have problems doing a quality process. Okay. So again, that it's not suitable for exploration. We don't have to have theory-derived hypotheses to do this process. There's lots of different things we could pre-register. So we could pre-register that we don't have hypotheses, that we're going to use a contingency. So if this, then that. A series of studies, knowledge of a data set, many different features could be declared ahead of time that are currently usually not disclosed. Is pre-registration only for simple experiments? No, it's not. There's large areas of social science that analyze secondary data sets or what do I want to call that? Not quantitative, qualitative, there we go. Qualitative data. And these practices are gonna look different in those different communities. But there are alternative techniques such as open research notebooks that could achieve some of the same goals as pre-registration with practices that fit that type of research. A couple more myths, that it solves the file drawer problem. Again, we're only going to be solving the file drawer problem if the pre-registrations that we do are public and findable. So we can have a study registry like clinicaltrials.gov, and if all studies are registered and all results are reported, then we're good. Then we have solved the file drawer problem. But it's often the case that people don't report the results of their studies in clinicaltrials.gov. Not all studies are registered, so we only have things like NIH and NSF funding to mandate registration. So there's a lot of gaps still. The registered reports process is one way that we can work on this file drawer problem, because one of the things that makes registered reports unique is that journals agree to publish the data regardless of whether results are statistically significant or not. And you all, as government researchers, have an opportunity to do this too, where all results are reported, not just a selective subset. So, final myth, that it's easy. Again, it sounds really simple, but I think it's actually very, very challenging to do this well. And it's something that the community has to work on together to develop practices that work within specific areas. Okay? So a punchline of my talk is science is hard, registration is hard, but if it was easy, it wouldn't be fun. So that's all I've got. Thanks.